You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Amid heightened tension between the U.S., North Korea, and South Korea in recent weeks, we produced a few episodes about nuclear ambitions and deterrence on the Korean peninsula. In our first episode, we featured the voice of Sieg Hecker. He's a nuclear scientist and former director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and author of a new book called Hinge Points. It's the story of how North Korea went from 0 nuclear weapons in 2001 to an arsenal of nearly 50 in just 20 years. And it's an amazing story because Sig was there to witness it firsthand. His point of view on the so-called Hermit Kingdom is unique, so we're sharing the full story of what he saw there as a special bonus episode. It's produced in partnership with our friends at the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, Global Santa Fe, and the World Affairs Council of Jacksonville, with special thanks to Megan Torrey and Abigail Noyes from World Affairs Council of Connecticut. Global Santa Fe's program chair, Jim Falk, takes it from here.
Dr. Hecker, great to have you with us today.
It's my great pleasure, Jim.
So, your first visit to North Korea happened in 2004, and as you write in the book, it really was part of not track 2 diplomacy, but track 1.5. How did you end up there, and what is track 1.5 diplomacy?
Jim, I didn't want to go to North Korea. I'd hoped to never have to be in North Korea. However, my good colleague from Stanford, John Lewis, invited me to come along. And the essence of track 1.5 or 2 is that it's non-official, non-governmental. So it's a way for academics or others to provide a bridge, sort of a link to another side that we often don't talk to. So John had a relation, having been in North Korea several times before 2004. The North Koreans actually contacted John and said, look, we're going to take you to a nuclear center the next time. And that's when John called up. And I said, John, I don't want to go to North Korea. I've been in Russia, I've been in China, I've been all these other places. However, he was persistent, and I wound up in North Korea.
Is that something that happened frequently? And did we also have high-level visitors such as yourself visit some of our nuclear facilities in the United States?
Of Russia, without question. And it wasn't just scientists, it was nuclear weapons scientists like myself when I was at Los Alamos at that time. So we actually were able to go to the Russian Los Alamos, their nuclear weapons laboratories, and they came across to our laboratories. So we had them in the laboratories. In fact, it wasn't just exchanging and talking. We actually did scientific experiments together because we had very similar interests to be able to get to areas of science that are difficult to get to, that we both had interests in. And so we did experiments together. And then eventually, we also did a lot of work together as to how you protect nuclear weapons, nuclear materials, etc. We did something similar with China, although much less so. It turns out China has always been sort of a more sensitive issue for the United States. But nevertheless, we had exchanges. We had Chinese at Los Alamos. I was in the Chinese nuclear weapons complex. So these indeed are great opportunities for the scientists, and in this case, the nuclear scientists, to be able to actually understand what the other side is like.
So when you first went in 2004, which was essentially a private visit, what was the reaction of, say, the Department of State or our intelligence agencies here? Were they supportive of it, and did they immediately want to debrief you?
So it was very interesting. First, the getting there was interesting. At that time, in 2004, I was still at Los Alamos National Laboratory, but not a government employee because the laboratory was run by the University of California. So it was still non-governmental, non-official. But of course, I had to get approval from the U.S. government to go. And so before I went, in essence, this was during the time of the Bush administration. The people in the National Security Council, including the CIA, I was not allowed to be briefed by those people. Nevertheless, in the Department of Energy, and one person in the Department of State at very high level thought, why not? Why not let Hecker go? He might learn something, because 2004 was a particular difficult time in relationship with North Korea, in that they had withdrawn from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and so they said we could find out something. When I came back, then the situation was totally different. I essentially briefed everyone in the government, and then I was more welcome. Some folks, of the hardliners, were still skeptical.
Why do you think at that time in 2004, and then even subsequently, that the North Koreans were so open and wanting to show you what they did?
So they were open, and that's one of the things that really prompted me to write the book. So I was in North Korea 7 times, and what I learned, the discussions, what I tried to do in the book is actually bring the reader inside of North Korea, to share with them what my experience was. And so in that my first visit to North Korea in 2004, they were incredibly forthcoming. They were very, very open. And then they showed me so much. As I describe in the book, I actually wound up touring through their nuclear facilities, holding their plutonium in my hand. Now, for all of those of you who might move back a bit, it was in a glass jar. It was sealed, and if you have plutonium in a glass jar sealed, it's not going to hurt you. So they actually showed me that much. And the reason for that, Jim, at least what I surmised, was that in late 2002, the Bush administration confronted the North Koreans, and that confrontation essentially killed the deal that the Clinton administration had made, which froze the North Korean nuclear plutonium complex from 1994 to 2002. And so at that point, the North Koreans, then to get back at the Bush administration and the Americans, they expelled the international inspectors. They withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and said, we're going to build the bomb. So this was now in early 2003. We move into late 2003, and nothing happened. And quite frankly, I think the North Koreans were just ticked off. They said, hey, look, we go ahead, we go move in the direction of building a bomb, and nobody seems to care. So they invited John Lewis. They didn't know of me at the time. They invited John Lewis to come and show him some things. And I figured when John tells them I'm going to bring Hecker along, there's no way the North Koreans are going to approve that. Well, it turns out for them, that was the coup de grace. They're not only going to show enough that we conclude they have the bomb, but they show it to a former director of Los Alamos National Laboratory. So they specifically, what they wanted from my visit was to show me enough. No BS. They really showed me a lot. And then have me conclude, boy, if I can see that piece of plutonium, if they can make that piece of plutonium, they can make the bomb. And in the end, that was the bottom line.
So your access on your first visit in 2004 was quite a lot. Did that change over the period of the 6 future visits?
So it was very interesting. For the most part, sort of the straightforward relationship I had with the North Korean nuclear program stayed constant, essentially all the way through. However, when I went back in 2005, when I went back in 2006, they said, okay, we cannot take you to the nuclear center this time. In 2005, they said we're actually reprocessing plutonium from one of their reactor runs. And they said, so it's not safe for you to go there now. However, the director met with me in Pyongyang, and I got an update as to what was going on. In 2006, when I was there, it was just weeks after the first nuclear test, when they were finally going to show the Bush administration, look, you're not paying any attention, you're not working with us, you're not willing to listen with us about our desire to actually normalize relations with the United States. We're going to show you. So they did a nuclear test. So we were there. They also said, we can't go there now. 2007, 2008, those were very, very good visits. Again, I got access to lots. 2009, this was just after President Obama went into office, and that was very different. They basically told us, look, you don't know how bad things are going to get. They essentially told us they're going to walk away. Then in 2010 is when they actually showed us the second path to the bomb, the uranium enrichment centrifuge facility. And that wasn't anywhere near as wide open as the first couple of visits, but nevertheless, we still had very fruitful, very important discussion. So they invited me back.
So a key part of your book is explaining that North Korea really did have a strategy, and it was a dual track strategy of diplomacy and nuclear weapons. Elaborate on that, would you? Because I think that's something that we really don't understand or appreciate.
Yeah, that's certainly my sense. I also didn't understand that fully at the time I was going there. And the last visit was the 2010 visit. However, what I was able to do, again, I'm a technical guy, so I went there to work with the technical people. My colleagues are the ones that understood the policy and the diplomacy aspect of all of this. And so what I finally figured out, and then of course I followed North Korea ever since the last visit in 2010, then it took me some time to figure out that when I bring together the interplay of the technical world and the diplomatic world, that's what then convinced me that what North Korea has done essentially since 1990, when Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un's grandfather, was in power, he actually had made the decision that with the end of the Cold War, with Russia going different directions, China linking up with South Korea economically, that it might be just better to seek accommodation or normalization with the Americans. And so my view then, Kim Il-sung was interested in normalization and diplomacy to get there. However, because of the nature of North Korea, by that time, I mean, their military was nowhere close to what South Korea had, certainly nowhere close to what the United States had. And their economy was in the dumps. And so they couldn't trust themselves to the outside forces. They had to try to do it and do this diplomacy from a position of strength. And that's, in essence, when they said, look, we have to develop nuclear weapons. Our conventional can't compete. And that's where then this strategy of dual track is try diplomacy, see if you can reach normalization with the Americans, but at the same time, make sure you also develop the nuclear capabilities in case that doesn't work out. And what I do in the book is I track those two through three American administrations, and that is George W. Bush, then Obama, and Trump administration.
This would be a good point to explain what you mean by hinge points. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time to go through all of them that you identify and discuss in such detail. But let's start with what happened in 2002 with George W. Bush administration, which you call, I believe, a fateful hinge point.
Jim, it was a disaster. That's what it was, because at that time, they didn't have nuclear weapons yet. They had the bits and pieces, but most of the important parts were frozen. The way that the hinge points developed is because North Korea always kept that second option, that is the nuclearization, building the capabilities for nuclear weapons open. That came to points where, in that time, in 2002, the Americans discovered, and actually it was already known in the Clinton administration, but latest information came up, that North Korea, while they were freezing plutonium path to the bomb, were exploring and developing the uranium path to the bomb. So that then was a very key decision point. So what do you do about that? Well, that's a hinge point. What the Bush administration did is they walked away from the plutonium deal also. And that was a very bad trade-off, because in the uranium, and again, I explain in the book exactly, the best as we know, what North Korea was actually doing in uranium enrichment. They were definitely pursuing uranium enrichment, but it would take them another 10 years or so to get to where they can build a bomb. Whereas in the plutonium, it was well known that they had what we call spent fuel, used reactor fuel, in a cooling pool that could be taken out and reprocessed in a matter of months and then build the bomb in less than a year. So that I call a hinge point, and they made a bad decision to go ahead and walk away from the deal.
One of the things that I've found surprising is North Korea has been described as the hermit kingdom. At least my understanding is that it's such a poor country. We know about starvation and so forth. I don't imagine them having great universities. How were they able to develop technologically so much that they've been able to do?
A lot of people believe, because of what you just said, North Korea being a small, poor country, they couldn't have possibly done this themselves. Someone helped them. Well, it turns out, from my standpoint, no one helped them directly to build the bomb. And so they're actually much better than what we would give them credit for. Their university systems are better. They're very smart. Now, they did, of course, have some help. The initial help came from the Soviet version of Atoms for Peace. President Eisenhower, actually this year, this December, is going to be the 70th anniversary of Atoms for Peace. So that program was, we're going to help you other countries that don't have the bomb and forswear the bomb, in other words, won't go there, we're going to help you doing peaceful nuclear energy. And North Korea took advantage of that from Moscow. Iran took advantage of that from the United States. So that gave them at least an initial start. They sent people to Moscow, and then the Soviets actually built the first little research reactor. You don't build the bomb with that, but you learn how to do research, you learn how to take steps towards nuclear electricity. But it certainly helped them. But then the North Koreans, by about 1980 timeframe, decided they're going to go ahead and get much more serious, not just this peaceful stuff, but actually to do the things they need to do to build the bomb if they decide to do so. Then in that process, from 1980s up into the time frame that we're talking about, the North Koreans were just both very good engineers, not necessarily world scientists the way that the Soviets and the Russians were, but very good engineers. And then they were so clever of being able to pick things out of the international literature and also to take advantage of what I call the European black market in nuclear things. And one of those guys who took advantage of the European black market was A.Q. Khan. He was the notorious Pakistani scientist. And yes, they did then in the 90s link up with Pakistan and with A.Q. Khan. He helped them along their way towards the centrifuges, but A.Q. Khan was not the reason that North Korea developed the nuclear bomb. They already had their own path in the plutonium direction. They learned a lot. They reverse engineered a lot of what was done in Europe. And then along the way, they've just continued to improve both their nuclear capabilities and their missile capabilities.
The United States always seems to take the position that China can exert a great deal of influence on North Korea in a variety of ways. And have you found in your visits as well as follow-up research and communication that is the case or not?
So from my discussions with the Chinese, from my discussions with the North Koreans, China did not help North Korea build the bomb. Russia, Soviet Union, did not help North Korea to build the bomb. In both cases, there were exchanges in the missile arena where the North Koreans certainly benefited from the capabilities that they were able to get from China, but North Korea did not get the bomb because of the Chinese.
So to give us a better sense now of the leadership, of course, Kim Jong-un has been satired years ago in that Sony Pictures movie, I believe it was called The Interview, which did not work to their advantage because it's alleged and I guess proven that North Korea then hacked into Sony's computers and caused a great deal of damage. But have we underestimated Kim Jong-un?
Oh, I think so, absolutely. First, the most important thing is we didn't know him. We didn't know much about Kim Jong-un, and we knew almost nothing about his military. And so actually one of the benefits we got from Trump's reaching out to Kim Jong-un, which happened at the very end of 2017 and then wound up with the Singapore summit, is in that summit, we learned more about Kim Jong-un than we had known since he came to power in December of 2011. But yeah, we didn't really understand Kim Jong-un, and effectively, he's been able to build up a remarkable capability, and quite frankly, a dangerous capability in combining the nuclear devices and the missile capabilities.
You and I first did a book talk about 6 weeks ago here in Santa Fe, and it was shortly after there was a great deal of publicity about his 9 or 10 or 11-year-old daughter. But she's continued to be put in the forefront, which seems really quite astonishing.
When you asked me that some time ago, I said, look, I don't want to go there. I don't want to guess as to, is she really going to be important? Is she going to be the heir? It turns out, as you just mentioned, ever since, she's appeared in photos and at places that you just would never expect to see a 10-year-old young lady. And so it's become much more serious, I think. It really does look like Kim Jong-un is putting her up there as showing her as that she's going to be the next heir and the Kim family will keep going. But in the end, we really don't know. It's peculiar, but it's being done.
Dr. Hecker, talk about the Obama administration.
The Obama administration took a very different tack with North Korea, with Iran, as you well know, very different from George W. Bush. But in the end, it wound up in the same place, and that is North Korea developed more and more bombs, more and more missiles during the 8 years of the Obama administration. And so I point out several hinge points also in the Obama administration. One came very early. President Obama came into office in early 2009. The North Koreans decided to greet him with what they called a satellite launch. And in fact, it was done essentially right before President Obama's famous Prague speech in April 5th of 2009. To President Obama, that seemed to really turn him off and put him in the same mold that you can't trust these North Koreans, provocations, they try to extract the benefits, and so they're not really interested in diplomacy or normalization. There was one more chance in 2012 with something called the Leap Day deal. And again, whereas President Obama and his people thought they actually had a deal with the North Koreans, this was now with Kim Jong-un in power of 2012, is again, they launched a satellite. And so that really finished up North Korea as far as the Obama administration is concerned, and they never got any closer. And so during the Obama administration, then the North Koreans were riding of this dual track. They were riding the nuclearization. They tried diplomacy a couple of times. It didn't work. And so then that got us into the Trump administration. And in the end, I just saw one of the headlines of one of the reviews of my book saying, failed U.S. policies towards North Korea were a bipartisan affair. And that's indeed, the hinge points demonstrate that.
So when President Trump initiated the first summit meeting, were you, Dr. Hecker, feeling optimistic? Did you think it was a good idea? And from the conversations you had with people across the world, was there some degree of optimism at that first summit?
Yeah, there certainly was in my camp. And in fact, I had published just before that summit with my Stanford colleagues a long narrative about where we could go from here. And it was really my hope that Trump or someone in the Trump administration would walk in that direction. And that narrative essentially laid out an approach that said what we need North Koreans to do is to halt, roll back, and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. And I said that's going to take 10 or so years. My colleagues Bill Broad and David Sanger in the New York Times had a big headline that said, Hecker says it's going to take 15 years, because when Bill Broad asked me, you sure they can do it in 10 years? I said, no, I'm not sure they can do it in 10 years. Maybe it'll take 15 years. So we'd actually laid out the potential expectations. And so I had some hopes. And indeed, in my opinion, Trump walked away from that summit in exactly the right mode. There wasn't much detail. He was criticized for that. But in the very short joint statement, they had the two key things. North Koreans said they wanted normalization. That was in the statement. Trump said we wanted denuclearization. That was in the statement. So that was very positive. The problem then was, how do you get from there to the next summit in Hanoi? And there, both the Americans and the North Koreans just made major mistakes. North Korean mistake was they never allowed their people to work closely with Steve Biegun, who was our envoy for these talks, who was a superb diplomat. They waited for the final get-together of Trump and Kim Jong-un in Hanoi. The American mistake was that, quite frankly, John Bolton was back in the government and National Security Council, and he had prepped Trump very well to make sure that no deal would be made, and then he was better walking away. And the peculiar thing is, when Trump walked away, he was congratulated by both sides of the political spectrum. Better no deal than a bad deal. I wrote a piece shortly thereafter, and I said, really? I don't think so. And we're paying the price for that today.
That's an important point, is that there really was division within the U.S. government, and that John Bolton had an extraordinary access, and from day one was adamantly opposed to any normalization of relations with North Korea.
That's correct. And he's proud of it. In his book, Surrender is Not an Option, he talked about essentially that first hinge point, and then in the next book, The Room Where It Happened, he talked about the Trump and Hanoi hinge point. I guess what I have to say is, let's look at the result. We are at the point today where North Korea is only one of 3 countries in the world that can threaten the United States with nuclear weapons, the other 2 being Russia and China. For heaven's sakes, how did we get there? That's what I try to cover in the book.
What is the best approach for the United States now vis-a-vis North Korea? And I would add to that, what are we doing?
So today we are in a totally different world. So this dual track diplomacy, the interest in diplomacy, that was there for 30 years. Each one of the Kims, I try to demonstrate, had an interest at some time in normalization with the United States. I'm afraid today, as we sit here in 2023, that we've had a phase change, pattern change, and that is that Kim Jong-un and North Korea today is no longer interested in that accommodation with the United States. They've decided instead to switch back to Russia and to China. I've worked with the Biden administration, and they show their frustration by essentially saying they won't answer the phone. We're willing to talk to them, and they're not willing to talk. So now it's going to take a complete rethink as to how we get back to actually dealing with North Korea.
So when we read in the paper, and it's almost every day, about their missile tests, how do you view it? Do they have the capacity to reach the United States? And if not, when do you forecast that they might be able to? And how strong is our defense?
So the important part today is that, in my opinion, they can reach all of South Korea and most of Japan with a nuclear-tipped missile. They've done enough nuclear tests, they've done enough missile tests that we have to believe that they can do that. And for example, many of the tests you've seen in the last couple of weeks are much more like operational tests rather than research and development tests. So they're definitely moving in that direction. They have that capability. We don't know exactly, how much bomb fuel, the plutonium and uranium they have, but it's enough for perhaps 40 to 60 bombs. That's one heck of a lot. And this is what they can do as far as reaching South Korea and Japan. It's my opinion they do not yet have the ability to reach the United States with any certainty on their part. In other words, they can't be confident. They've never straightened out any of their ICBM tests so they can go as far as the United States. They've demonstrated they have the horsepower to be able to reach. They've shown in nuclear tests, they've probably tested a hydrogen bomb with a yield over 200 kilotons, which is 10 times that of Nagasaki. So it's serious business. But to mate those two together, in my opinion, is going to take more. When will they get there? I don't know. The problem is they've walked consistently in that direction. They're much farther today than we would have expected them to be 10 years ago. So unless somehow we can get back, first of all, make sure we protect our assets and our allies, but then also to get back to talk with North Korea and see whether there isn't a different way forward.
That was Jim Falk, President Emeritus of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, currently chair of Global Santa Fe, and Sig Hecker, the author of Hinge Points.